His religious reforms weren't solely motivated by a desire for power. The king's decisions may actually have been sparked by personal beliefs that had been evolving during his upbringing. Amenhotep felt that Egypt's magnificent past had been forgotten and overshadowed by the cult of Amun. Now he was king. He could reinstate the grandeur of the old kingdom to his land. In his attempt to return to the old Egyptian ways, Amenhotep embarked on a drastic religious revolution. He held a Sed festival on his second year on the throne, a celebration usually made after 30 years of rule. It was to signify major changes in Egypt, for soon after he changed his name to Akhenaten and set out to eradicate the worship of the Egyptian pantheon except the Aten. Initially, he launched an attack against Amun, but soon all gods except the Aten were targeted. Temples were closed, their priests exiled, and festivals to the old gods strictly forbidden. His new religion was not so much new, just a modification of what had come before. Many argue that he wanted to create a simpler, purer religion, free from the mystery that had come previously. Amun meant hidden one, and so Akhenaten set out to expose and erase him from Egyptian culture. Temples were no longer dark and mysterious, but now open and free to bathe in the Egyptian sun. No underworld existed in his new religion either. It seemed only good could exist in Akhenaten's eyes, and evil and suffering did not. At least he didn't want it to. An afterlife but no underworld, light but no dark. 4 years later he moved the royal capital from Thebes to a new site which he named Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. The reasons for this are unknown, although it has been proposed that an assassination attempt may have prompted the decision. A site which had never been built on before, perhaps so it had no prior connection to the old religion, it was 6 miles long and 3 miles wide, and became the home of around 30,000 inhabitants, with elaborately built palaces, gardens, temples, workshops and villas. Tombs built at Akhetaten were built on the east. No longer were the dead buried in the west, where they would travel through the underworld and eventually be reborn into the daylight the following morning. Now the underworld did not exist, at least according to the king. The deceased would only rise into the daylight. Whilst the dead were still mummified and buried with objects like shabtis and canopic jars, tombs were enveloped with images of the Aten. The city itself was an extension of Akhenaten's religious doctrine. One-storey bright white buildings filled the city so that all corners of Akhetaten enjoyed the sunlight. No shadowy temples or dark streets could be found. Everywhere was open, in full view of the Aten. Ten years into his reign, Akhenaten made an increasingly violent attempt to erase the religion of the new kingdom. He sent men to deface images and cartouches of the traditional Egyptian deities. Even the word gods was erased from Egyptian monuments. Images and names held great significance in Egyptian culture. To speak a name or draw an image could bring something into existence. Removing these would have symbolically eradicated their presence, something which would have undoubtedly scared the Egyptians. Statues were destroyed and scenes relating to the cult of Amun were hacked away, including the images of the divine birth of Hatshepsut. Akhenaten also set out to destroy images of Amun in small figurines and amulets that the ordinary people possessed. Now soldiers patrolled the streets. People began to deface their own objects in fear of them being found by the king's men. Real fear had set in. It seemed that the evil in Akhenaten's religion came only from himself, in his attempt to uphold his reforms. art also evolved during the reign of Akhenaten. Although it had begun to change during his father's reign, the king was represented in a more unusual way than had ever been seen before. No longer did he choose to be depicted as the athletic, youthful and idealistic way that was typical in Egyptian art. Pictures of the king show a man with snake-like eyes, thick lips, a narrow face and rounded hips. This portrayal was not a realistic depiction. Genetic studies have confirmed that Akhenaten didn't suffer from any conditions which would have made him look this way. It may have been another endeavour to return to the old ways, this time to the style of pre-dynastic Egyptian art. As a young man, the king may have encountered figurines and images from this era that had spurred a deep respect for his ancestors. Amarna art centred very much around the royal family. Personal scenes of the king with his wife Nefertiti and their children were common, and only they were pictured in the presence of their god. Even tombs of officials were decorated with images of the royal family. Traditional tombs depicted the deceased in scenes of everyday life, often with different gods and goddesses as he made his journey to the afterlife. Now the royal family were depicted on every wall, and no image was left untouched by the king's presence. Of course, there are many ways to interpret all of these changes. As well as a return to Old Kingdom traditions, it may have also been an attempt by Akhenaten to reinforce his divinity and right to rule. In some way, he tried to make himself the protagonist of his own religion. He even claimed to have lived on Mart, which only the gods had been said to before. Was Akhenaten attempting to make himself almost a god in his own right, to affirm his right to rule? No matter how he chose to be depicted, Akhenaten surely couldn't have hoped his new religion would have lasted. The loss of state religion probably didn't have a major impact in the lives of the ordinary people, but closure of the temples would have been felt by the local community. Certainly they would have suffered from the loss of jobs, trade, and even the festivals they had once enjoyed. Without popular religion, people could no longer pray to the gods that had once helped them through difficult times. Without Osiris, king of the afterlife, how could the Egyptians expect to live peacefully in the afterlife? Now, only the royal family could share their next life in the land of their god. The ordinary people would haunt their tombs for eternity. The Aten was intended to take responsibility for every aspect of life, but the faceless disc was clearly a poor alternative. The king's religious policies didn't just affect his own people. Now that Akhenaten chose not to accept evil, he did not engage in violence of any sort. To the king, violence belonged to the previous pharaohs, those that had associated themselves with the warrior god Amun. For these reasons, he kept out of foreign affairs, shying away from any threats of war, but this did not go unnoticed by his enemies. The Hittites, an ancient people from modern-day Turkey, claimed Syrian lands that previous pharaohs had fought hard to capture, and Nubians began to rebel against the Egyptian Empire. This was a devastating blow for Egypt. Not only were tax-paying lands lost to the king's enemies, but he was also denied access to Levantine ports, which rendered Egypt unable to import timber, an invaluable commodity that was scarce in Egypt and necessary for trade, defence and religion. Akhenaten's visions were crumbling before him.